Thank you everyone for joining us um, and welcome to our event. My name is Ron Patkus and I'm the head of the Special Collections Library here at Vassar. Also an adjunct associate professor in the history department. I'm going to give some short introductory remarks here. And just so everyone knows from the beginning, this webinar is being recorded. Anyway, I guess I would start by saying, one of my roles in the library is to develop, um, working with colleagues, exhibitions and related programming, which draws on the rich collection of primary sources we have at Vassar. Often, as you might imagine, this involves marking various anniversaries. And so, of course, given Vassar's history as an institution of higher learning, I knew that this year, 2020, it would be important, necessary for us to focus on the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Um, our plans, of course, have been changed this year in many ways because of COVID. Presented some challenges along the way, um, but we have gone forward. And in the end, we decided to focus on a virtual exhibition instead of a physical exhibition in the library. Um, that online exhibit, in case you haven't seen it, is available on the library website, and I'd encourage you to go and take a look at that if you haven't seen it yet. If you do go, you'll see that it documents the contribution to the women's suffrage movement of students, alumni, faculty of Vassar. And it highlights both well-known and lesser-known figures. I'm very grateful to the team that was assembled and that worked most closely on that project. I'd like to give some thanks to them. I first want to thank Mark Seidel of the Special Collections Library, who served as the exhibition curator. I want to thank Miriam here of the history department. She was our faculty partner and she wrote a very important essay which appears there. Nicole, who you can also see, she's the head of the library's digital team, and she helped us produce the marvelous website that we have. And I also want to thank George Laws in the communications office who designed an accompanying print publication. I should also note that our art librarian, Thomas Hill, interviewed Mark and Miriam recently for his Library Cafe radio program. And you might want to go and listen to that. That's available on the art library website. I think you'll find that interesting as well. The exhibitions that we do when they're physical exhibitions, or even now with online exhibitions, they typically have they're typically accompanied by associated programming. And I'd really like to thank President Bradley for convening early on this year a team that could explore the various programming possibilities for us. I want to recognize those who served on that team. They included Timothy Kane of the Development Office, who was the chair, Lisa Tesler from the AAVC, Amanita Duga Carroll from the Communications Office, Barbara Olson from Greek and Roman Studies and Women's Studies, Miriam, and Wesley Dixon of the President's Office. Tonight's event is actually one of two opened up to the Vassar community this semester. In September, we had a Votes for Women program that featured presentations by our alum Sherilyn Eiffel of the NAACP's Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also Professor Cohen and Professor Tanisha Means of the Political Science Department. Tonight's event, as you know, will feature Robyn Muncy, who you can see here, and we're really looking forward to that. I want to thank also the various programs and departments that co-sponsored this event. They include, in addition to the library, the President's Office, the History Department, and 3 programs: Women's Studies, Africana Studies, and American Studies. So our plan for tonight is that I'm going to turn things over to Miriam, and she'll introduce our main speaker, Robyn. Robyn will then give her presentation, and following that, we're going to have a question and answer period, which Nicole will moderate. And just to let you know now, for that Q&A, we'd like you to submit your questions via the Q&A button that you should see on the bottom of your screen, not the chat. So altogether, even though we started a few minutes late, we're aiming for something in the range of an hour. And that's our plan. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And I'll turn things over now to Miriam.
Thank you, Ron. It's truly a pleasure to introduce Robyn Muncy, our speaker this afternoon. Muncy is professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is guest curator of the exhibit Rightfully Hers, American Women and the Vote at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. She is also on the advisory committee for the National Votes for Women Trail, a project sponsoring historical markers in all 50 states. Robyn's first book, Creating a Female Dominion in American Reform, 1890 to 1935, made a critical contribution to our understanding of women's roles in progressive era reform. Through an exploration of women's networks that emerged in educational institutions, in local, state, and national campaigns for social justice, and in government, she helped us understand how women built the early welfare state. Her next book, Relentless Reformer, Josephine Roach and Progressivism, is the biography of a much underappreciated activist whose contributions to social justice span the progressive era, the New Deal, and the 1960s. Some audience members may recall from Robyn's talk here in 2011 that Roach is a Vassar graduate, class of 1908. It was at Vassar that she, like the women we celebrate in the exhibition, first honed her ideas about social justice. Muncy's book is the study of Roach herself, but it's so much more. For one, it provides another model of women in 20th century politics. Roach's priorities usually placed her in tight coalitions with men. They often overlapped with the networks of women reformers Muncy studied before, but these coalitions were different. Also, Muncy's book reveals that Roach's work as director of the United Mine Workers Welfare and Retirement Fund, one of America's largest private health and pension programs, contributed crucially to the establishment of Medicare in 1965. In doing so, Muncy helps us to understand how private welfare structures contributed to the making of America's public welfare state. In both of her books, Muncy highlights the connections between women's fight for suffrage and their work in other social movements, just as we show in the exhibition an essay on the Vassar activists. Now, in her work on the 19th Amendment, as we will see, Muncy continues to make those connections. This afternoon, she'll also provide us with a broad, inclusive look at the suffrage movement. Like the best of the recent scholarship, this view restores to their rightful place women who participated in a movement that was far more diverse than the community of women who attended Vassar at that time. Finally, she has something to tell us about the long process of social change, which is so relevant now as we take stock of the recent election. In a 2019 interview with the New York Times, Muncy said about the suffrage movement, quote, "It's important to remember how piecemeal a struggle it was. Seeing change as coming in one fell swoop," she continued, "undermines us as citizens and gives us a false idea about the way change happens." Building on that idea, her lecture today is aptly titled, "Partial Victories All, American Women and the Vote." I know you are in for a treat, so welcome back to Robyn Muncy.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that beautiful introduction. I am delighted to be back at Vassar, if only virtually. And I want to extend my own set of thanks to so many people who made it possible. I want to say thank you so much to Michelle Whalen, for instance, and Nicole Scalessa for taking care of logistics and publicity for the event. Thanks to all the sponsors, including the History Department, to which I feel so committed and close for their support of this webinar. A special shout out to Mark Seidel, who has already been mentioned, at the Vassar College Library for permission to use images from his online exhibition, Votes for Women, Vassar and the Politics of Women's Suffrage, which has already been commended to you, but I do so as well. And finally, an extra special thank you to Miriam Cohen, Evelyn Clark Professor of History here at Vassar, who is a consummate organizer, colleague, and historian. I understand this event is the last that Professor Cohen will organize before her retirement at the end of this academic year. And I want to dedicate this lecture to her in recognition and gratitude for her long and distinguished career here at Vassar and in the larger historical profession. So I'm going to do that crazy Zoom thing and try to share my screen. So we'll see what happens here. I hope we've got it. Great. All right, I think we did it. Fabulous. So this lecture, which is titled, as Miriam said, Partial Victories All, American Women and the Vote, is for Miriam Cohen. All right, to start the lecture itself, I hope this is gonna work. Whoops. Okay, we're gonna try another stab at this. Okay, I think this is going to work. Yeah. It doesn't want to. There we go. It wouldn't be 2020 if it came off perfectly smoothly, right? I mean, this is what 2020 is for us. All right. I want to share with you this photo of the actual 19th Amendment, which is held at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. As it was debated in the early 20th century, the nickname for this amendment was the Woman Suffrage Amendment. And as perhaps you can see in the little summary introduction right under Joint Resolution, Congress itself described the amendment as one that would extend, quote, the right of suffrage to women. What the amendment actually said, however, was neither so clear nor so comprehensive. What it said was that no state or the federal government could deny the vote on the basis of sex. What was left unsaid was that the states could deny women the vote on almost any other grounds than sex. Still, when the amendment was ratified in August 1920, newspaper headlines all over the country proclaimed in one way or another, American women win the vote. Following that lead, those of us who teach US history for years referred to the ratification of the 19th Amendment as the moment when American women won the vote. Many people, including historians, still do. But here's the thing. The 19th Amendment did not enfranchise American women. Despite constant claims to the contrary, beginning in 1920 itself, it is actually inaccurate to say that the 19th Amendment enfranchised American women. It is inaccurate for two main reasons. First, millions of American women had the vote before the 19th Amendment, and second, millions of women were still barred from the polls after the 19th Amendment. This is not to say that the 19th Amendment was unimportant. Indeed, it was one of the most significant milestones in the history of American democracy. By enfranchising on the order of maybe 25 million women, it undergirded the largest single expansion of the electorate in US history. It also generated measures to ensure women's more visible participation in electoral politics as candidates and party activists, as well as voters. And we are watching the legacy of those measures unfurl even today, as more women were elected to the US Congress in last week's election than in any other in all of US history. And as a woman is Speaker of the House of Representatives, and a woman is Vice President-elect. In addition, for a few years in the early 1920s, the 19th Amendment created a surprising degree of political power for organized progressive women, who won, as a result, one of the first pieces of federal social welfare legislation in US history. By 1984, women began consistently outvoting men in presidential elections, and an ongoing gender gap in those elections had opened up in 1980. Through the policies created by those voting patterns, among other ramifications, the 19th Amendment continues to shape our lives today. Still in all, these achievements do not mean that the 19th Amendment enfranchised American women. Millions of women had been enfranchised by state action before the 19th Amendment was ratified, and millions of women were, and many continue to be, denied the vote on basis other than sex. Getting straight on the meaning of the 19th Amendment is really important. By claiming that the 19th Amendment enfranchised American women, we give the impression that the vote was won in one fell swoop. That representation obscures the raggedy, piecemeal, and ongoing nature of the struggle for women's enfranchisement. There was no one clean moment of victory, no sharp break between the era when women were unenfranchised and when they were enfranchised. The struggle for women's votes has been and continues to be a tough, often ugly struggle with only partial victories and many setbacks. When we obscure the grittiness, unevenness, and limitations of the struggle, we veil the way that significant political change has actually happened in the United States. And when we get that wrong, we defeat the purpose of doing history, which is to explain continuity and change. Even more important, we rob ourselves of understanding how to make political change now. Understanding the real meanings of the 19th Amendment is thus vitally important. So let's have a look at the first reason it is inaccurate to say that women won the vote in 1920, which is that millions of women exercised full voting rights before 1920, and even more enjoyed partial voting rights. These women won access to the polls through state action, either acts of their state legislatures or a referenda on which all male voters had a say. In some places, local jurisdictions enfranchised some women on local issues like municipal bonds or in school board elections, but the state level was where the greater power lay. States had the power to enfranchise women in any or all elections, including national congressional elections and presidential elections. And some states did extend the vote to women on the very same basis as men before the 19th Amendment was ratified. That is, women in some states faced the same eligibility requirements as men and voted in all the same elections. These successes of women's suffrage through state action before 1920 helped to create the momentum in Congress required to pass the federal amendment. That is, the federal amendment succeeded in part because so many women were already voting. The 19th Amendment embodied in part the existing electoral power of American women. This is one aspect of how political change happened in the case of women's suffrage. Many of you will know the evidence for this point already, but let's make sure we all do. The first examples of continuous enfranchisement for women on the same terms as men were in the West. In 1869, when Wyoming was organized as a territory, it enfranchised women in every election on the same basis as men. When Wyoming became a state in 1890, it continued that tradition and became the first state since the Revolutionary era to enfranchise women and men equally. Utah was next, though the history of women's suffrage there was much more uneven. Like Wyoming, Utah enfranchised women on the same basis as men when it was a territory. That was in 1870, when Mormons held the lion's share of political power in Utah. Many in Congress were so appalled by the Mormon practice of polygamy, however, that Congress revoked women's suffrage in the territory in 1887. One example of the many reversals in the struggle for women's voting rights. Women in Utah exercised the vote on the same basis as men for 17 years and then had it taken away. In 1896, when Utah was admitted to the US as a state, it re-enfranchised women on the same basis as men. Since Mormons had by then officially renounced polygamy, Congress did not object. Utah is but one example of the raggedy and uneven character of women's enfranchisement, something we miss entirely if we say simply that women won the vote in 1920. And by missing this unevenness, we miss the precarity of voting rights themselves. We miss the continuous struggle required to retain rights after gaining them in the first place. As for our catalog of suffrage victories at the state level, Colorado enfranchised women on the same basis as men in 1893, and Idaho did the same in 1896. So before 1900, 4 Western states had enfranchised women on the same basis as men. Indeed, as you can see on this map, nearly all women in the West exercised voting rights on the same basis as men before the 19th Amendment was ratified. Washington State extended equal voting rights to women in 1910. California did the same in 1911. Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona followed suit in 1912. Montana and Nevada did so in 1914. In the Midwest and East, the situation was more mixed. New York, after a grueling campaign, enfranchised women on the same basis as men in 1917. Michigan did the same in 1918. More common in the Midwest and Northeast was presidential suffrage or other forms of partial suffrage. Illinois famously enfranchised its women in presidential elections and local elections in 1913. North Dakota and Nebraska did the same in 1917. In that same year, 1917, Rhode Island granted presidential suffrage, as did Indiana, Tennessee, and 6 other states in 1919. Kentucky granted women presidential suffrage in 1920 before the 19th Amendment was ratified. This string of suffrage victories in the late 19th and early 20th century meant that 15 of the 48 states had enfranchised women on the same basis as men before 1920, and another 12 had granted at least presidential suffrage. That is, over half the states, 27 of 48, had enfranchised women in at least presidential elections. The result was that 339 presidential electors in 1920 would have been elected in part by women, whether or not the 19th Amendment had been ratified. That's 339 out of 531. Before the 19th Amendment was ratified, the majority of presidential electors depended in part on women voters. Men in Congress and state legislatures, of course, took note. As more and more congressmen were from states where women either elected them or would cast votes for the presidential candidates of their political parties, support for the 19th Amendment increased in Congress. It is hard, in fact, to imagine that the 19th Amendment would have passed through Congress without so many women already enfranchised. In this process, we see an important component of how political change can happen in the United States. On the ground struggle at the state level over several generations eventually paid off not only in single state enfranchisement, but also in the federal amendment. When we say that women were enfranchised in 1920, we obscure all those decades of successful grassroots struggle and electoral activity of women in the states where millions of them voted before 1920, and by doing so, made the 19th Amendment possible. I'd like to offer you a few examples of that on-the-ground grassroots struggle. From these very few particulars, we'll learn some of the tactics used by suffragists and also who exactly was involved in the movement that led to the 19th Amendment. I especially want you to see that the movement became increasingly diverse in the early 20th century, and that in the final decade before ratification of the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage movement constituted a genuinely mass movement of women and men from all economic classes, as well as virtually all racial and ethnic groups. As to tactics in the 19th century, women suffragists perfected a broad range. They petitioned and testified before their state legislatures as well as the US Congress. Here is a petition. I don't know if you can make it out. This is a petition signed by two of Frederick Douglass's children. You can see Frederick Douglass Jr. at the top of the men's side and Mrs. Nathan Sprague over on the women's side. They also organized women's rights conventions, gave speeches to mass audiences in lecture halls and churches. They published not only just articles, but even their own newspapers. They painted slogans on horse-drawn wagons, filed lawsuits, handed out broadsides, and harangued their kith and kin. Some promoted third parties, such as the Prohibition Party and the Populist Party, when they endorsed women's suffrage. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, some engaged in nonviolent direct action by presenting themselves to county clerks and election judges, claiming that as citizens of the United States, they already had the right to vote. They often rooted these claims in the 14th Amendment, and the tactic would eventually be called the New Departure. One practitioner of the New Departure was African-American journalist Mary Ann Shadd Cary, who in 1871 joined 63 other women in trying to register to vote in Washington, D.C. They were denied registration and protested by submitting affidavits attesting to what they saw as a violation of their citizenship rights. Shadd Cary soon testified before a congressional committee on behalf of women's suffrage, and she remained a suffrage leader until her death in 1893. Susan B. Anthony and 14 other women tried the tactic more famously in Rochester, New York, the year after Shadd Cary's attempt. This band of activists actually convinced the election judges that they had the right to vote, submitted their ballots, and were arrested for doing so. Anthony was tried in court for violating state voting laws, as were the election judges who allowed her to vote. I'm sure I should not get a kick out of that, but I do. Anthony was found guilty and proudly refused to pay the fine levied for her offense. She was recently pardoned by President Donald Trump, something historians believe she probably would have regretted. The same year that Anthony voted illegally, an interracial group of women in Portland, Oregon, attempted to vote there. You can see this is a little write-up in the newspaper about that. And after these women in Portland, after they carefully explained their understanding of their citizenship rights and their determination to vote, the election judge kindly accepted their marked ballots and tucked them under the ballot box rather than into the box, as the women preferred. In this more decorous case, no arrests were made. Such scenes replayed across the country in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Brilliant examples of the grassroots activism of early suffragists. One of those examples, this one originating in Missouri with a woman named Virginia Minor, led to a Supreme Court decision in 1875 in Minor v. Happersett, which concluded that US citizenship did not carry with it a right to vote. Thus did the New Departure officially die. But echoes of the strategy continued through the century. In 1891, in Lombard, Illinois, for instance, 1891, Lombard, Illinois, a group of women figured out that the town charter said that all citizens of voting age were eligible to vote in town elections. Gender was not specified. 14 women, all white and elite as far as I can tell, presented themselves to the election judges and made their case for their municipal voting rights. According to a local paper, the judges were stupefied by the suggestion. In the paper's own words, the three judges simply collapsed. The polling place was a sort of general store, and one judge was so shocked he reportedly fell into a flour barrel. Another leaned up stiff against the wall. That's a quote from the newspaper. And a third was taken with a spasm. The town council eventually ruled the women's interpretation valid, and their votes were counted. Here was an unexpected victory of partial suffrage through grassroots activism, and evidence of just how raggedy the achievement of women's suffrage has been. In the early 20th century, suffragists added new tactics, some of which reflected the increasing diversity of the movement. They marched in massive parades and delivered speeches from open air cars. They organized trolley tours in some states, including New York in 1908 and Connecticut, as you can see here, in 1912, which allowed them to make their case to crowds in smaller towns and rural areas. When denied their preferred venues, suffragists were willing to meet just about anywhere, even in cemeteries, as Vassar students famously did in 1908. In that moment, Vassar College president James Monroe Taylor refused to allow suffrage speakers on campus. In response, about 40 Vassar students, led by the intrepid junior Inez Milholland, hopped the fence between the college grounds and Calvary Cemetery to hear speeches by several bright lights of the suffrage movement. They included Vassar alum Harriet Stanton Blatch, feminist Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and trade union leader Rose Schneiderman. According to the press, Schneiderman received the greatest applause of all the speakers that afternoon, as she urged Vassar students to use their privilege in support of working class women who needed the vote to improve the conditions under which they labored in America's industrial workplaces. This event among the gravestones in Poughkeepsie's Calvary Cemetery is such an iconic moment in the suffrage struggle that the Votes for Women Trail Project is seeking permission to install a marker in the cemetery to commemorate it. This is not yet a done deal, but we have high hopes, and I urge you to stay tuned. Very exciting. A few years after the cemetery meeting, suffragists became the first activists ever to picket at the White House, another important tactic that emerged in the early 20th century. Vassar alum Lucy Burns was a prominent organizer of those pickets, as well as the first of about 500 suffragists to be arrested for her participation. She and many other jailed picketers ultimately declared themselves political prisoners and began a hunger strike. Some were brutally force-fed, including Burns and another Vassar graduate, Elizabeth McShane Hillis, whose typed notes describing the horrific ordeal are featured in the Vassar Library's online exhibition, an incredibly powerful document, which I hope you will consult. You can see only one page of it here. It's incredibly powerful. Although nothing like hunger strikes, suffragists undertook other sorts of risky tactics as well. In 1912, Indiana suffragists dropped Votes for Women buttons from a hot air balloon to publicize one mass meeting. And in 1915, Vassar grad Hazel Hunkins leafleted visitors to an international fair in San Francisco from an airplane. This photo, of course, is not a photo of her airplane, but I just thought you needed to be reminded, we all need to be reminded of what airplane travel was like in 1915. You know, these are not jumbo jets. These are scary contraptions. Much less dramatic, but perhaps more effective, suffragists also, of course, organized mass canvassing campaigns to identify their allies and to convince doubting men to support the women's suffrage cause. I love a New York Times description of one day of such canvassing in New York City during the summer of 1915. On June 29th, a broad range of suffragists scattered throughout the city to canvass especially working class men of multiple races, religions, and ethnicities in order to win votes in an upcoming referendum on women's suffrage. The Times reported that Black suffragists would canvass Black workers, Jews would approach Jews, and in the Times' own words, Large numbers of German and French women will visit their compatriots. There will be Italian workers. One woman will go among the Hungarians and another among the Austrians. There will also be a Greek woman canvasser. When the canvass was underway, the Times highlighted a group of canvassers led by immigrant laundry worker and union member Maggie Hinchy, who preached women's suffrage in the subway trenches just being dug in the city that summer. There was never a band of suffrage pilgrims who made such a trip as these women, gushed the Times. They visited engine rooms, they slid down into the subway trenches, they climbed little ladders out of them, and they crossed from one side to the other on minute bridges. Everywhere, according to the Times, they were received with applause from the unskilled Irish, Italian, and Greek workers underground. This one day of suffrage activism in one city illustrates some of the diversity of the suffrage movement by the 1910s and the massive grassroots effort required ultimately to win suffrage for women. Moreover, although not in evidence in June 1915, Chinese descended women had also begun participating in New York's suffrage campaign. Most prominent was the teenage immigrant Mabel Lee, who on horseback led a group of women from Chinatown in a New York City suffrage parade in 1912. And by that time, such immigrant Jewish labor activists as Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, and Clara Lemlich had long been battling for suffrage among union men in New York City's garment district. Schneiderman was in demand as a suffrage speaker across New York State, as well as in working class communities in other states. It was, in sum, a multi-ethnic, multiracial, cross-class mass movement that convinced New York men to enfranchise the state's women in 1917, and in the bargain, to move the needle toward a federal amendment. Indeed, the movement had become generally a multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-class movement by the 1910s. The first wage earners suffrage league was organized by working class women in California, for instance, and its members marched in a 1908 suffrage parade in Oakland, along with members of Waitresses Union Local Number 48 and several middle-class suffrage organizations. Latina Maria Guadalupe de Lopez was president of the College Equal Suffrage League of Southern California, where she delivered suffrage speeches in both English and Spanish. Suffrage activism in California's Black community centered in places like the AME Church in Stockton and Third Baptist up in San Francisco, as well as the Colored Equal Suffrage League of Oakland and an interracial organization in San Jose called the Political Equality League. California enfranchised women on the same basis as men in 1911. And in the presidential primary the next year, one of California's enthusiastic new women voters was Chinese American Tai Lung Schultz, much featured in the local press. The same sort of coalition was evident in Illinois by the early 1910s. In 1913, the internationally renowned African American activist against lynching, Ida B. Wells-Barnett, organized many of Chicago's African-American women into the Alpha Suffrage Club, which became a major force in Chicago politics. And Emma Steghagen, a member of Chicago's Boot and Shoemakers Union, simultaneously founded the Chicago Wage Earners League. The Wage Earners League ultimately enrolled thousands of women workers in the city, and its efforts were materially supported by working men in the Chicago Federation of Labor. Allied with middle-class white suffragists, this cross-class, multiracial movement won municipal and presidential suffrage for Illinois women in 1913. I wish I had time to give you loads of additional examples of the tactics and diversity of this mass movement in the teens, but you get the point. Women's enfranchisement has been the result of hard and creative work by women of all classes, races, ethnic groups, immigration and citizenship statuses, urban and rural residents. Women from these groups have often acted apart from each other, often acted despite and sometimes even against each other. But the signature victories of the women's suffrage movement up through 1920, including the 19th Amendment itself, were won when the smaller and more scattered initiatives of the 19th century had generated a broad and diverse mass movement. A lesson for the ages. The 19th Amendment did, of course, lead to the enfranchisement of millions of women in states where they had exercised no vote or only partial suffrage. These included states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Florida, Mississippi, and Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas. I don't want to downplay the significance of the amendment. It was a magnificent victory, full stop. But it was not a complete victory. It was not complete because millions of women still were not able to cast a ballot after its ratification. And this is the second reason that it is inaccurate to say that the 19th Amendment enfranchised American women. The amendment made clear that neither the states nor the federal government could just disfranchise anyone on the basis of sex. That particular phraseology meant first that territories could disfranchise on the basis of sex, and second, that the states could disfranchise women and men on bases other than sex. Race was the only other ground on which states could not explicitly deny the vote. After 1920, millions of Americans were, and many still are, disfranchised on other bases. First, the territories. We'll take Puerto Rico as our example. Because the 19th Amendment did not forbid the territories to deny the vote on the basis of sex, women in Puerto Rico had to approach their territorial legislature for the vote. And Puerto Rico's territorial legislature refused in 1920, even though a suffrage movement had been active in Puerto Rico for many years, centered especially in the labor movement. After 1920 then, several important new suffrage associations formed in Puerto Rico to continue the battle for women's enfranchisement there. When the legislature continued to resist, some Puerto Rican suffragists appealed to the US Congress for aid. In 1929, as you can see in this letter from Puerto Rican suffragist Ana Velez, the US Congress was on the verge of passing a bill to enfranchise women in Puerto Rico. That threat was enough to convince the territorial legislature to enfranchise literate women in that year. But not until 1935 did all adult women gain access to the polls in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rican women's struggle for the vote is an explicit part of the movement of American women to gain the vote. And yet it is excised from the history of that movement if we end the story in 1920, when the most vital era of suffrage activism in Puerto Rico actually began. While Puerto Rican women were all US citizens when the 19th Amendment was ratified, many Native American women were not, and so did not benefit immediately from the amendment either. This part of the women's suffrage story is complex because some Native American women, maybe half, did have US citizenship and gained voting rights along with other women in their states before or in 1920. Moreover, there were important Native American suffragists, including Marie Baldwin from the Turtle Mountain Chippewa, who is pictured here, Gertrude Bonin from the Yankton Sioux, and Laura Cornelius Kellogg from the Wisconsin Oneida. But not all Native Americans had US citizenship until 1924, when Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. Even after that, though, many states found ways to deny the vote to American Indians living on reservations. Some states claimed that because Indians were living on reservations, they were not residents of the state, and so ineligible to vote. Some excluded Native groups because they were not taxpayers or because they were considered wards of the state. Efforts by Indigenous people to gain the vote continued state by state, actually, and in some places county by county, into the post-World War II era. As you can see from this affidavit, in which Julia Dennett Claw protested her rejection for voter registration in Shiprock, New Mexico in 1946. Although New Mexico loosened its restrictions on Indigenous voting rights in 1948, nearby Utah continued explicitly to exclude Native Americans from the polls until the mid-1950s, after which many subtler forms of barriers have continued to be erected to bar Indians' access to the polls. One of the broadest exclusions from the polls after 1920 was, of course, that of African American women in the South. African American women in the South were largely disfranchised after ratification of the 19th Amendment by the same means that had, by that time, effectively disfranchised African American men. In a concerted effort to tamp down the political power of Black men after Reconstruction, some Southern states instituted poll taxes, that is a tax required to vote, or literacy tests administered unfairly to exclude Black voters. The threat of economic reprisals for voting and brute violence were also used to prevent Black men from voting. These same methods were employed to exclude Black women from the polls after ratification of the 19th Amendment. Black women fought back. Against all odds, they tried to register to vote in Southern states throughout the 1920s. Some were successful. Many more were turned away. But even after many failed attempts, some determined women did not accept their didn't accept this refusal of their voting rights. They returned repeatedly to registrar's offices and filed complaints with the US Attorney General and US President, asking what the federal government was going to do to protect their constitutional rights. One such protest, this one from LULA MURY of Birmingham, Alabama, for instance, sought help from President Calvin Coolidge in 1923. In her letter, MURY explained that she remained unable to register to vote despite the 14th, 15th, and the 19th Amendments, which she knew guaranteed her that right. She asked for Coolidge to intervene. Department of Justice files are full of such protests. The federal government in that decade provided no aid, but the record of Black women's persistent demands is clear and bracing. It reveals one of the meanings of the 19th Amendment. It became a resource in the ongoing struggle of women who remained barred from the polls. In the 1930s, African American women like Amelia Boynton in Selma, Alabama, continued to demand their voting rights. Boynton managed to register to vote in 1934, and she encouraged her friends and neighbors to do the same, despite the difficulties and even dangers involved. She kept up her voting rights organizing in Selma for 3 decades. Eventually, in 1965, Boynton helped to bring John Lewis and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King to Selma for the voting rights campaign that included a march from Selma to Montgomery, widely considered to have been a pivot in the struggle for Black voting rights. Here she is in this picture, this photograph. She's praying with other activists before beginning the first attempt at that march, which is now referred to as Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. She, like so many other marchers, would be brutalized by state troopers as she tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Women like Lula MURY and Amelia Boynton need to be included in the roll call of suffrage activists. By 1964, their relentless, on-the-ground, grassroots efforts had once again coalesced into a mass movement, which won a constitutional amendment abolishing the poll tax, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act outlawed those unfairly administered literacy tests in places where less than 50% of the adult population was registered to vote. And it sent federal registrars into the South to register Black voters in places where discrimination was demonstrable. By 1967, more than 50% of voting age African Americans had registered in the 6 states fully covered by the Voting Rights Act, and American politics was fundamentally changed. The struggle continued too for women who were members of language minorities. Attention to their cause increased significantly in the late 1960s. In 1975, when Congress was considering its renewal of the Voting Rights Act, some activists from the Latinx community urged that the Voting Rights Act be expanded to protect the voting rights of language minorities. Vilma Martinez, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, won support for expansion by testifying at a Senate hearing on extension of the Voting Rights Act in 1975. The League of Women Voters submitted a powerful written statement on behalf of expansion as well, and Representative Barbara Jordan from Texas was a major supporter of the measure in the House of Representatives. While we could explore many additional examples of continuing voting rights activism among many groups excluded from the polls after 1920, I hope the point is sufficiently made. It is inaccurate to say that American women won the vote in 1920. Millions remained barred from the ballot after that year and continued to work for voting rights. American women's struggle for the vote did not end in 1920. Instead, American women's suffrage activism continued through the 20th century and continues to the present day. Women such as Latina labor leader Dolores Huerta, Cathay Feng, and Sylvia Albert at Common Cause, Stacey Abrams, founder of Fair Fight, Myrna Perez, director of voting rights and elections at the Brennan Center, as well as the women active in Unite America, for instance, remain important leaders in the fight to protect Americans' access to the vote. To conclude, the history of the 19th Amendment demonstrates how misleading it is to claim that American women won the vote in 1920. It is misleading first because millions of women won the vote before 1920, and second, because millions remain disfranchised after 1920. Indeed, the achievement of voting rights for millions of women before the 19th Amendment made the 19th Amendment possible. And that is a lesson in how American democracy works. Suffrage history shows that significant political change often takes shape over generations through on-the-ground grassroots struggles that coalesce at various moments into diverse mass movements that win signature victories, such as the 19th Amendment or the abolition of the poll tax. Persistent grassroots struggle and building diverse coalitions are key. And it also shows that even these big, amazing victories, while major milestones, are not the end of the road. They become important resources in continuing struggle. It is a big deal to get this history right, because if we claim that American women won the vote in 1920, we misunderstand not only the history of one constitutional amendment, but how American democracy works and what it demands of us. This history shows us that fundamental changes in the structure of US politics and policy have not been made in a single moment, after which participants dusted their hands and moved on. A more accurate history of the long struggle that led to the 19th Amendment and of its contentious aftermath shows us that even such crucial issues as whose consent is necessary to democratic governance have never in the United States been decided once and for all. Contention over voting rights is perpetual in the United States. It may be less visible or urgent in some periods, but it is endemic to American political culture. That means the matter of who votes is currently in our hands. The suffrage struggle is our struggle, and it always will be. The thought that the issue of who votes will never be finally put to rest may feel, understandably, exasperating and exhausting. But the history of women's suffrage reveals our persisting responsibility in the matter. And if we see how dauntless earlier suffrage activists have been, then surely we can be dauntless too. And we will make clearer just how dauntless they were if we avoid the misleading claim that American women won the vote in 1920. Thank you.
Thank you, Robyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Oh, my pleasure.
So we are getting some questions in the Q&A. Let's see. So I should say I did see some raised hands. If you could post your questions in the Q&A, that would be great, and I will read them off. So just a general comment, excellent lecture, so informative, such dynamic presentation. So thank you, Marilyn. So I'll begin with, we have one that maybe Ron could answer. It's Vassar history. When did Vassar begin to address and showcase the role of Vassar women in the suffrage movement and make students aware of the significant plaques about suffragists in the chapel? Can anyone answer that? Miriam, you're muted.
I could say a little that.
Great.
I would say that in terms of what I know about the history in the history department, I'm sure that came and went. My guess is that in the early 20th century, some of those activists did that. It waned in the middle part of the century in terms of what, the notion of women's history being something that was special and important. It then exploded again with the women's movement. And so I would say that by the time, by the late 1960s, early 70s, it became important. And it was certainly then by the time I came, Vassar was already a coeducational institution in the late 1970s. Date tells you how long. I was hired in part to teach specifically that area of history, along with other aspects of 20th century history. So I think that's, we do have some, we do have a plaque to a couple of people up in the chapel about that. And I think I think it tells you something about the general history in the 20th century. I would say there were times when other things were, you would have seen in the 1930s and 40s here at Vassar, a lot of attention to labor history and to and Robyn's nodding her head. But the kind of rediscovery happens later with the women's movement.
Great, thank you so much. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's see here. We're getting quite a few. Okay, so here's a good one for either Miriam or Robyn. Why are we changing the term suffragettes to suffragists, as news articles of the movement used the former term?
Yeah, so the suffragist was the term preferred by the overwhelming majority of suffrage activists in the US, because suffragette was a term meant to make fun of and diminish suffrage activists. And suffragists in Britain actually took it on, suffragette, as a way to kind of redefine it and give it a positive spin. But in the US, there was only there's a tiny group actually in New York City, that did take on the term suffragette, but all the rest of the suffragists across the country continued to use what they consider to be the more dignified term, suffragist. So we're going to stick with suffragist when we talk about the American movement.
Great, thank you.
Great question.
Let's see. Could you elaborate on Revolutionary era women's voting rights, for instance, New Jersey?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. Yes, one of the reasons that I would say, and I would make the argument that the issue of who votes is endemic to American political culture, is because it has been an issue from the founding of the Republic to the present day, right? And so at the 1776, yes, New Jersey enfranchised women on the same basis as men, and women actually did vote in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in New Jersey. In fact, we had some evidence of that years ago, but just in the last year, during this period when people are doing so much research on the suffrage movement, new evidence of women voting in New Jersey has emerged. So we know that it wasn't, it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an oversight in the law. The intention was that women who had a little personal property would vote just like men with a little personal property would vote. And they did so from 1776 to 1807. But in 1807, the New Jersey legislature took the vote away. They reinterpreted the law and took the vote away. And one of the things that seems to me so important about that, another thing that seems so important to me about that story, is that it is another example of the raggedy, uneven process by which women have struggled for and then gained or lost the vote. And it again underscores the precarity of voting rights, that they have been given and then they have been rescinded over and over and over again in some places on some issues among some communities. So I think the New Jersey example is a really important one.
This next question actually kind of rolls into that idea of rescinding the ability to vote. After the enactment of the amendment, was there a counterstrike to undermine the amendment, like prohibition?
Well, actually, here I'm in Maryland, and there was a lawsuit that was raised by guys in Maryland to try to say that the amendment was itself not allowable, and so Carrie Chapman Catt was actually holding her breath at this point because she knew that there would be lawsuits. Maryland actually put forward one of the ones that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it was found to be to have no basis. But yes, so there were attempts to like kill the 19th Amendment altogether. There was that. And then of course there were lots of very successful attempts to undermine it in certain states among certain populations, like for African Americans in the South. Those measures, those that had that disfranchised African American men had been sort of perfected already. But as new work by Liette Gidlow shows us, there's the southern states actually developed yet new methods of restricting the vote, like the all-white primary, making that a much more comprehensive and sort of solidified practice that emerges and becomes more comprehensive and widespread after the 19th Amendment. And she sees that as one of the ways that some states responded to women's suffrage, and they used that primary to keep Black women from voting. So yeah, so there are various measures taken.
Great, thank you. And this is a follow-up to the Revolutionary era voting. Someone stated, it's my understanding that African American women also voted in New Jersey. I don't know specifically if we have evidence that African American women did, but they certainly were allowed by the law to do so. So African Americans, immigrants not yet naturalized, and women, any inhabitant. This is what it said. It didn't even say citizen. It said any inhabitant in New Jersey who has something like 50 pounds of personal property. It didn't even have to be real estate. So if you had enough furniture and clothes and tools to add up to this 50, I think it was 50 pounds. I hope I have that right. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. But if you had that, then, and you were just an inhabitant of the state, then you had what it took. You were eligible to vote. Yeah. And that language actually brings up another question about the kind of negative language of the 19th Amendment. Why does it say no one shall be denied the vote based on gender, rather than taking a positive position and saying all people regardless of gender?
That's a good question.
Right. It was modeled after the 15th Amendment, which said that no state could deny the vote on the basis of race. And so the two movements, the movement against slavery and the movement for women's suffrage, are very tightly allied. In fact, embedded in each other before the Civil War, and they split apart later. In fact, in part over the 15th Amendment. Wouldn't have been the anti-slavery movement at that time, the anti-racist movement. And so since the model of the 15th Amendment was out there, the advisors, the crafters of this amendment, to the way they would have put it, of course, was to enfranchise women. But of course, that's not the effect that it had. Use that model.
Thank you. There's also some questions surrounding why wasn't there more support by the white women suffragists for their African American counterparts?
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic question.
Right.
So, and I don't know if you mean before or after the 19th Amendment itself. I mean, I think one of the most shocking moments in this history comes in 1920, when African American women, when it becomes clear that African American women are going to be fought by registrars in the South, and African American women go to the National Women's Party and say, for instance, and to the League of Women Voters, which was the kind of the inheritor of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Black women went to both of those organizations and said, we need help. And they were absolutely rejected, turned away by both organizations. And so the claim was made by Alice Paul and the National Women's Suffrage, or the National Women's Party, that this was a race issue, not a women's issue.
Right.
And the National American Women Suffragists, or the League of Women Voters, made a kind of similar claim that this is not that the suffrage struggle is over, right? I mean, so it shows you just how damaging it is not to have an intersectional understanding of identity, right? Because if you really cared about women, if you care about women, you have to care about every basis on which women can be discriminated against or have their well-being undermined, right? It doesn't have, I mean, if you really care about women, and so if that amendment had said, I mean, think of how different things would have been if that amendment had said, no state or the federal government can deny the vote to women. That would have been an entirely different amendment, completely different. So yeah, so it's racism, of course, and an understanding of white women as being the quintessential women that wrote for them women of color out of the picture after 1920. And of course, then there's a long history, which I don't have time for that, but of the ways that race structured the movement leading up to 1920. And one of the dangers of taking the approach that I did to the talk tonight is that by emphasizing that the movement before 1920 had become multiracial and cross-class, I risk leaving the impression that the movement was all sunshine and roses among those groups. And of course, that was not the case. That in the main, not entirely, but in the main, Black and white women, for instance, struggled for suffrage in separate organizations. In the main, working class white women and middle class white women fought in different organizations. I mean, the very same hierarchies that structured American society structured the suffrage movement. And as Jim Crow emerges and becomes concretized in the late 19th and early 20th century, the women's suffrage movement becomes even more structured by race, and the moments of interracial activism become harder and harder to achieve. It's not that they're not there, they are, but they're harder and harder to achieve, and the tensions are really intense. And that is true between working class white women and working class and middle class white women as well. Just they managed to work together and do some things together. They're able to do marches, together. But boy, the tensions are just awful because of the condescension and class conflict.
So one good question too, what was the rationale for the states to grant women the right to vote in presidential elections and not municipal elections or vice versa?
Right. So it was easier to get a president. So you didn't have to change your state constitution. One of the things that some suffragists figured out was that that a state legislature alone could enfranchise women in presidential elections or in just municipal elections. There were kind of these partial steps that could be taken without having to change the state constitution. And changing a state constitution, as New Yorkers know so well, is really, really hard. In every state, I mean, it's different in each state, but they're all multiple steps, and it take years. You sometimes had to have, a legislature in each of 2 separate sessions vote yes, and then it would have to go to all the voters for a referendum. I mean, oh my gosh, it took forever. But suffragists figured out that, okay, well, we could get some leverage here by going for partial suffrage, and that was way easier. And so Illinois was a kind of test case there. And when several other states saw that went so well, they took on that plan as well. And it was really important in achieving the 19th Amendment then, because the women were able to put so much pressure on the parties, basically.
I think Ron, do you want to, I mean, how you doing, Ron? I think we have worked, Robyn, a lot.
Yeah, the remaining questions are mostly comments about personal experiences as Vassar students and questions regarding items in special collections and things in that area. I don't know how much more time we have or if we should have them contact Ron more directly.
Yeah, it's 6:45, so we should probably.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for
but
your commentary in the Q&A. There's some really great stories and personal.
Absolutely. Email, right? And we could even forward some. I'm going to volunteer Robyn on our behalf. You know, we could even forward some to her too.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. I would love to see them. I would love to see them.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
thank you again.
Oh, my pleasure.
I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and that was really great, Robyn. I can't imagine a better presentation, and just seeing all the questions, I'm sure there'll be some more coming after that. But thanks to everyone for attending, and we'll try to keep this going.
Right, and look at go to the website, the exhibition. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I can save your comments from this Q&A once this is over. So please email Ron your stories and your questions regarding special collections. We would love to learn more about your experiences and share with you our great collections at the library.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Can she?